Chesler. She's Emerita Professor of Psychology and Women's Studies at the City University of New York, best-selling author, published thousands of articles, studies, many, many best-selling books, and recently released a book entitled An American Bride in Kabul, a memoir. Phyllis Chesler, welcome to today's Issues.
Oh, I'm so pleased to be with you down south because up north there is snow on the ground. And I heard your weather discussion, and I thought, oh my, what's coming my way?
I think what's coming from Chicago is going to New York, and so...
No, but as you get older, the weather becomes more of a player in terms of your bones and your capacity to view it as whimsical and playful as opposed to, as you put it, an endurance test.
Amen. I guess we understand what you're saying, but I do notice the older you get, the more the weather seems to affect. I know those old timers, they can say, "Hey, I got my knees acting up. Must be some bad weather coming in." The next day or two.
True. Well, if you think this is bad, you should try Kabul in winter.
Good segue.
Because I have never been so cold in my life. It is amazing to think that this is Afghanistan, the country where I was held for 5 months in captivity, and I'll tell the story.
Take us back first, if you would. We're talking about what year are we talking about when you moved there? You married a Afghan?
Well, I went to college as a scholarship kid.
Okay.
And I was so impressed with meeting a glamorous, presumably wealthy, very sophisticated, and completely westernized man. And I was a kid. I was very naive. And he followed me everywhere. I didn't realize that he was stalking and monitoring and possessing my boundaries the way many Afghan men do of their female property for whom they're responsible. I thought it meant he really loved me. I was a child. I was 18 and a half when I met him. So after about 2 years of being best buddies, study partners, discussing American and European cinema and painting and philosophy, he said, well, if we're going to travel together, and I was longing to travel the wide world and have a grand adventure, he said we would have to marry. And since at that time neither of us were religious, seemingly so, that has changed for me, but not for him, I thought, well, all right. He said, I can't introduce you to my family if we're not married. And no one in America, in a university in 1959, 60, 61, knew anything about Islam or about Central Asia or about the Middle East or about the history of Muslim imperialism or colonialism or conversion by the sword or slavery. No one had a clue about the religious and gender apartheid that has characterized Islamic history. So I thought, gee, what an adventure. So we had a civil ceremony and sailed off to Europe. And in a sense, my opening sentence is, I once lived in a harem in Afghanistan. And I love that opening sentence because it reminds me of Izzat Dinninson's I Had a Farm in Africa, when she begins her book Out of Africa. And indeed, we both had romances with continents and cultures and grand adventures. I nearly died, but you don't get to have a grand adventure without risking illness and death. So meanwhile, we're going across Europe, and I'm visiting museum after museum, and then we land in Kabul, where I discover suddenly for the first time that my father-in-law has 3 wives and 21 children, something that my Afghan husband never mentioned. Didn't come up. He never thought to mention it. Maybe he was either ashamed of it because he was modern in orientation or because he thought it would put me off, so he deceived me. And then an airport official took away my American passport. And I said, you can't have that. And they said, oh, it's a formality. We'll send it to your home afterwards, madame. But they never did. So I became, in a sense, a citizen of no country at that moment. and the property of a very large, powerful, polygamous Afghan family. And the first few days were very thrilling because half of the city came to greet this young man's return. And the food was delicious, and the carpets were thick. After the third day, I wanted to get out and see the city, surrounded by these high mountains, snow-capped peaks. But I discovered that I was meant to live in Purdah with the women only. And the men went out only with each other to do business, which meant meeting officials. And in my husband's case, he had brought home with him not just an infidel and American, but an infidel Jewish-American bride who had no Afghan ancestors and who could in no way contribute to his family. So he had to prove that he could tame the American infidel. And his task was not easy because I was an American young woman with a sense of adventure, with high spirits, reading books all the time, and didn't think I was meant to lead a life in prison. So that sets the scene for you.
We're talking to Phyllis Chesler, Chesler. Her book is titled An American Bride in Kabul, a memoir from the best-selling author of Women and Madness. And the book tells her story, Phyllis's story. She's been talking to us about how it all started. And took place in the late 50s, early 60s. And so if you want to get a copy of the book, it's called An American Bride in Kabul, right?
It is. Now, you know, I could have written this book 50 years ago, but I didn't. And the reason that I wrote it now is because here I am minding my business, and 9/11 happens. Here I am minding my business, and the Al-Aqsa Intifada happened a year before. And when 9/11 happened, I said, well, now we are all Israelis. And just as I was held hostage in Afghanistan, it was the country that gave bin Laden shelter. And now the immediate civilian world is being held hostage by bin Laden in terms of the Al-Qaeda brand of terrorism. And I realized that I was obligated to share not just what happened to me, but what has happened to other travelers from the West to the East, and what that means now in terms of the Islamic presence, often hostile and sometimes not at all, in the West. And Afghanistan itself seemed to have followed me right into the future, because you see burqas on the street, you see niqab on the street, and hijab, by the way, the headscarf, is fine because it doesn't obscure identity. And the burqa is not just a sensory deprivation isolation chamber and a movable prison, a moving prison, but it's also a security risk because indeed criminals and terrorists use it and make their escapes under burqas. So I understood that what I learned about women's lives and the indoctrination into tyranny, the acceptance of very totalitarian but primitive ways of thinking and behaving, what I learned about polygamy and about Purdah and about apartheid, the religious, my Afghan mother-in-law spent every day trying to convert me to Islam. And when I was resistant, she began cursing me as a Jew. So while we in the West can pride ourselves on being tolerant of all religions, and we in the West understand that America was founded by religious people who wanted the freedom to practice religion, we also understand that you can't force someone into a religion or kill them if they leave a religion. And in Islam, unfortunately, apostasy is a capital crime. So if you leave it, anyone on site is legally empowered to kill you. So I encountered a very different kind of culture than the one that so many educated, progressive, liberal, accomplished professors and human rights activists seem to have encountered in the East. They think that we're all the same and that everyone is equal and that everything is relative, and I really stand against those ideas.
Was there a moment in those early days when you realized, uh-oh, or I guess I'm asking, was there a in Kabul when you realized, uh-oh, I am really in trouble here. I'm not going to, the first day or so you're looking around, figuring things out, but was there a moment when you said, okay, I am really in trouble and I've got to get out of here?
Yes. There were several moments. I kept trying to escape, just to sightsee, but I was always brought back, and then I was sent with a male relative, a female relative, a chauffeur to take me to the tailor. And that was spooky, but all right, I thought, how interesting. I began to get sick. I developed dysentery. People laughed about it in the family because they saw Americans as having weak stomachs, and everybody got what was known as the Kabul trots. And I thought, oh, this is a different approach to illness and suffering. And then I made my first foray to the American embassy. And I said, I have to get out of here. I want to go home. That must have been 3 weeks into it, before many other things happened. And they were very polite and kind, but they said, where is your passport? I said, well, they took it away from me. They said, well, without your passport, we can't help you. And I said, but you hear, I'm speaking English like an American speaks English. Yes, but we can't help you. We can't get involved in the domestic affairs of the country that's hosting us. So then I understood that foreign policy meant that you don't tell a man what to do with his female property. You don't tell Afghans how to treat their women lest you risk a diplomatic flap. So some very nice Marines escorted me back home to the very palatial villa. And I thought, oh, I'm in a bit of trouble. Then, a little before that, we had a terrace, and I went out to read and sunbathe in the bathing suits. And there was this huge commotion of male voices yelling and screaming. And then my husband, home from the city early, and he said there are men working on a building on the roof about a quarter of a mile away, and they claim that they see a naked woman here. You must come in immediately. So I started laughing. I said, well, that's ridiculous. And he said, no. He said, please come in. If you don't, they will tell the entire town that we're running a brothel. So that was a worrisome moment. And then there were many more. But by then, I was already actively engaged in trying to figure out how I could get out. Like, could I walk out? I mean, if anyone has seen, I'd say, the Lone Survivor, the recent Navy SEAL film about that heroic mission with so many deaths into Afghanistan, this is a terrain that you can't walk out of. It is ice-bound. It is snow. It's deep with snow in the winter for 6 months up to the chest. There are no paths. There are steep inclines. But I was already thinking, okay, I'll go with the nomads. I'll walk out with the nomads. But, of course, I thought, well, why would they help me? They would probably marry me off to one of them, and that would be the end of me. So I knew I was in trouble, and I started to look around for foreign wives whose husbands were not diplomats, who might be able to take a risk safely to help me get out.
Wow. Phyllis Chesler is our guest, Chesler, and her book is titled An American Bride in Kabul, and this took place.